Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special Tergar event. My name is Stephanie Wagner. I'm one of the Tergar guides, and I am here today to facilitate a conversation with Dr. Cortland Dahl about his new book, A Meditator's Guide to Buddhism. I'm really delighted to be here with Cortland today, my longtime friend. For those of you that don't know Cort and his background, he is an author, of course, of this book and many others. He is a Tibetan translator. He's a Buddhist scholar. He is a scientist at the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he's also the executive director and co-founder of Tergar International. So amidst his many achievements and accomplishments, what often doesn't get talked about is how he is just such an amazing human. He likes to play jokes on others, and he also loves a big plate of nachos. So with that said, I want to welcome Cortland on. Cort, I am super excited. I can tell all your secrets, Cort. I just got to tell
It's all
you.
out there now. You all know the truth.
Yes, Cord and I have been friends for many, many years, I think 20 years. And so before Tergar and Mingyur Rinpoche was even in our circles. And so, Cord, I'm really delighted to be here today to first congratulate you on the publishing of this book and also to get to geek out with you on the topic of Buddhism.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here with you, Stephanie, and to be here with you all around the world. I'm seeing that you're joining from all over the globe. So wonderful to have you here and to spend some time with you. And hopefully it will be a fun discussion.
So I'd like to just actually first say a little bit about the format before we engage in our conversation here. So Court and I will be chatting kind of interview style between the two of us initially, but then we want to get you involved in the conversation. We'd love to hear your questions. And so we'll put a slide up here where you can scan the QR code with your phone. And then we'll also share the link to where you can put your questions, where you can submit your questions in the chat. So we'll post this again at some point, but if there are things that are coming up for you that you want to make sure that you get a chance to ask Court, please submit your questions here and we will include them in the conversation as I am able to do so. Okay, so I'd like to maybe just first talk a little bit more broadly about your entrance into Buddhism before we talk about the book, because I'm sure much of your, experience becoming a Buddhist and learning how to meditate, largely informed the writing of this book.
Yeah.
Um, seeing you now with all of like your achievements and your knowledge, it can be really easy to think that maybe you never struggled in your practice or you never had any doubts. And so my guess is though that that's not the case. What are some things early on that you felt like maybe you grappled with or you struggled with early on in your practice and on the Buddhist path?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I was definitely not the kind of person who just immediately uh, got going in the practice and just connected with everything and just was off on a smooth path. I had a lot of resistance, misunderstandings, a lot of doubts and hesitations, in particular about the more Buddhist side of things. I started meditating when I was 19. Actually, not far from here. I'm right by the University of Minnesota campus, which is where I started meditating. I was about 19 years old and struggling with a lot of anxiety in particular. I think many of you probably heard this, but in particular, I had a phobia of public speaking. So doing stuff like this would have completely freaked me out. And I did connect with meditation right away. I immediately found it beneficial. I immediately knew and sensed that it was going to be a huge part of my life, but I had a complete and total allergy to anything that felt religious to me. And the Tibetan tradition in particular, seeing the imagery and all of the practices, the complexity, a lot of what I now understand as the richness of this tradition. At the beginning, I just frankly didn't understand it and was quite turned off by it. So my connection with the more traditional side of the practice of meditation and the Buddhist tradition really took years. It was actually not until probably 7 or 8 years after I started meditating that I got a little bit more interested in the roots in the Tibetan tradition of the practices I was doing. And it was really just because I met some amazing people. I met some lamas, and it was just like, wow, these are amazing people. I need to maybe open up to this a little more than I had been. So it wasn't easy. I was filled with all sorts of doubts and misunderstandings.
And so, if you were able to give advice to that previous version of you based on what you know now, what advice would you give to yourself?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to one of the most fundamental things about the whole Buddhist tradition, which really was, I think, for me, one of the single most important things that I learned and made me, I guess, continue to stay open to it, even though it was a long, slow process. And that is that in the Buddhist tradition, again, going back to the Buddha's own teachings, um, it's really encouraged to have a healthy skepticism. And there's this balance between being open and being skeptical. So there needs to be space for questioning, for exploring, for examining. And at the same time, you need to have a certain amount of openness. And I think we can go too far to one side or the other. Sometimes we can be so skeptical that we're just not open. We're really not. We're kind of just staying in the comfort zone of our existing beliefs and perceptions. And part of the power of these practices is that they get us to see things we weren't seeing before about ourselves, about the world, and so on. So part of it, I think, is just simply that we need that openness. Otherwise, our skepticism becomes paralyzing. But I think we can also be a little too far on the other side where we might be open, but we're not really questioning and examining. And I think the questioning and examining actually is a pretty fundamental part of the Buddhist path. So I think it really just comes down to that. And um, the other part of that is just knowing that pushing up against the boundaries of our comfort zone is uncomfortable at times. It doesn't always feel good. It can be challenging. Sometimes it could be inspiring and feeling like it's a breakthrough. But other times it could be deeply uncomfortable, like we're challenging something about ourselves or some really, really deeply ingrained way of thinking or acting or seeing things. And that's powerful, it's transformative, but it's not always easy. So I think just a lot of patience and compassion for the process also is important.
Thank you so much for saying that. I think that, what you're pointing to really is finding the balance between the skepticism and the openness. And thank you for sharing your own experience with that, because I think sometimes, especially when we're new to practice, new to Buddhism, it can feel kind of lonely, like maybe we're the only one experiencing some of these kinds of doubts. And so even hearing from someone as practiced as you and as, that has the background that you do is really helpful around that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Now, I know that you had mentioned somewhere, and I can't remember where, that this book kind of emerged from you feeling like this was the book that you wished you would have had, early on in your practice. So I'd just be curious, before we start diving into the book specifically, what books were influential for you when you first started practicing and studying?
Yeah, books were such a huge part of my life. I mean, they still are, but especially at the beginning, because I've always been more solitary. Tend to be quite introverted. In fact, the first, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 years of my meditation practice, I didn't really even know other meditators. I didn't have any friends that were meditating. I wasn't part of any community. I've never been kind of a community person. I've since like deeply benefited from it, but it wasn't my nature to kind of go look for my tribe, so to speak. Um, so books were really my sangha in a way. That they were my inspiration, my companion. Actually, they were my Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha because I wasn't meeting teachers. I was just studying on my own. They were like my whole three jewels. Basically, were coming in the form of books. So there were a number, I mean, there's a lot of books I remember at that time. The thing that first comes to mind is probably, especially given what I just said about my allergy to the religious side, is going to seem a little counterintuitive. But just by chance, I was at the Minneapolis Public Library. I was a student, I was looking, I didn't have a lot of money to be buying books. And just by chance, I pulled this very traditional book called Words of My Perfect Teacher off the shelf. And the
Just some light
content of
reading.
that book, yeah. But bear with me here. For anybody who knows that book, this is like incredibly traditional, extreme, like not at all the book, that somebody who has an allergy to the religious stuff would gravitate to. And I think I wasn't ready for the content of that book. But what I remember is the pictures of these great Tibetan lamas. These pictures are like etched in my subconscious somehow. I remember even now as I say it, I can see this picture of Dudjom Rinpoche, one of the great lamas of the 20th century, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. That did something to me. I can't say what it did, but even just the fact that it's still coming up for me now, um, the information in that book I was utterly not ready for. But honestly, something happened, and just seeing those pictures, some connections were made. In terms of the teachings, I loved Jon Kabat-Zinn. I read Wherever You Go, There You Are. That, in my mind, is just one of the great meditation Dharma books of all time. I just love that book. So Jon Kabat-Zinn and his writings were huge for me. Um, I think similarly, A Path with Heart is a book. I read that twice. That's by Jack Kornfield. Sharon Salzberg's books. I got very into Zen, so I was reading, like Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, the works of D.T. Suzuki. And then there was other things that, again, kind of just captured my interest as like a young person trying to, figure out who I was in the world. And it was a little bit more of the esoteric, exotic side. Like I read these books by a woman named Alexandra David Neal. She was this French woman who traveled to Tibet, I think in like the 1930s. And honestly, the stories I think are half made up, but they're really, it's just like this painting this picture of this whole other world that was so different from my world. And it just captured my interest. I ended up traveling in Asia, and it I think really motivated and spurred me to just explore beyond my world, where I was living at the time and what I was doing. So yeah, I could make a very, very long list of books, but those are some of the ones that really stood out for me.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So I'd like to hear a little bit now. Let's move into talking about the book. Um, so I understand that you were approached by Shambhala Publications to write this book, which is wonderful. And I'm wondering, what unique contribution do you hope that this book makes to the body of Buddhist literature that exists already? In other words, how do you view this book as being sort of different than other books on Buddhism?
Yeah, another great question. Yeah, as you said, I actually didn't have any intention to write this book to start with. And Casey Kemp, who was then an editor at Shambhala, I think she's getting her PhD now, but she approached me, and we started talking and asked if I would be willing to write an introductory book on Buddhism. And at first, I was very interested in doing that. I just didn't have a lot of time to work on a book. And so at first I thought, I'd love to do that, but not now. I really don't have this time and space to do it. But we kept the conversation going, and I just got thinking about it more. And I think that comes to the answer to your question, which really was the reason why I decided to do it, is that I thought back to my own experience. I thought about the many, many students, especially in the Tergar community, who I've met, and the courses that we've designed for people who are interested in Buddhism and wanting to learn more about it. And I feel like there are so many amazing books about Buddhism, and a lot of them are the perfect second book to read. But there's not a lot of things that are like that first book where you just want to get a sense of what it's all about. What is this Buddhist path all about? How do all the pieces fit together? Hopefully something that's not too academic, not too philosophical, but something that's very real world for people, I think, like many of us who, and like I was, and have been, is I'm just a meditator. At the end of the day, I'm just somebody who meditates and has benefited from these teachings and is trying to live a life of awareness, compassion, and wisdom. And having that book that just provides hopefully a clear roadmap so you can get a sense of what Buddhism is all about from a very practical, experiential point of view. And then you can decide, like, yeah, is this something I want to go further with? Is this for me? Do I want to explore it further? And for some people, it might not be. There's many wonderful traditions out there. So I think that's really what it was for, just to to be that orienting book that gives you a sense of what the whole path is all about.
I've really appreciated the clarity of the book. I love the book so much, by the way, and congratulations. It's
Thank you.
very clear, but it's also very balanced. You know, you share a lot of stories, a lot of personal sharing, which I just think is really helpful. And then, of course, throughout the book, you've got these lovely meditation practices woven throughout. So it's really wonderful.
Thank
I'm
you.
curious, how does your meditation practice show up in the writing process?
That's an interesting one. Well, there's an interesting shift that happens, I think, probably for every meditator, where you you go from actually a friend and a colleague of ours, Lucas, who Stephanie knows well, and some of you might know, one of the Tergar guides. He actually said something that to me really captured something about this, which is the difference between meditating and being a meditator. And there's this shift that happens where at the beginning you're practicing and it's like, okay, you do your 20-minute meditation in the morning or your half-hour meditation or your 5-minute meditation, whatever it is, and then you go on with the rest of your life. And it's just this activity you do, for your mental health or for whatever reasons you're doing it. And at a certain point, it really gets into your being somehow, and it starts to be more or far beyond that 20 minutes in the morning. It might be anchored in that period of formal meditation, but it starts being really about your whole life. How do you bring more awareness, be more centered, be more grounded, be more kind and caring and compassionate, etc. Really, it just becomes how you live your life. And so when it comes to something like this, like writing the book, it shows up in many ways. I would say the biggest thing that when I look back on writing it is something that's it's really part of anything important that I do in my own life. Is I always, especially when I'm starting a new big thing, I always stop and try to make it all about compassion. And I remember with this, and again, this is just something that's become part of my life really, is just pausing for a moment and just thinking, okay, I'm just about to do this, in this case, writing a book. May this really be a benefit to others. Whatever this becomes of this, may it be whatever will be most helpful to others, will bring more inspiration and allow them to tap their full potential, or at the least just suffer less and have a more balanced, flourishing life. So I think that that element of the motivation is something that not only at the beginning, but throughout the whole process, just really trying to come back to wanting this to just do some good in the world. Even if just one person reads a few words, if it can be a benefit to that one person, hopefully it will have been worthwhile. So that's probably the biggest thing when I think about kind of the process of writing it and just always coming back to that. And it was helpful in that there were times, for example, as you mentioned, Stephanie, there's personal stories from my own life. And I really struggled with that, to be honest. Like at the beginning, there was much less of that. And I worked with this really brilliant editor named Haven Iverson, who I've now working with on a different book, just a really, really brilliant mind for publishing and editing and things like that. And she was reading and going through the chapters and helping with the editing, and then would say, "Oh, you need more a personal story here, or you need more of this and that," and was just giving me tips. And I really felt some resistance to that because I felt like I don't want this book to be about me. I want this to be for the people who read it. I want it to be about this beautiful tradition that has meant so much to me and to so many others. And I didn't want it to get so mixed up with my own personal story that it felt like, wow, this has somehow become, it's detracting from like the main message of the book. But then when I came back to that motivation, um, I think it was really just a sense of like, what is actually going to be the most skillful to help people benefit from some of these ideas. And then I remembered from my own life, actually, the stories are what I remember from these traditions. It's like the stories of the teachers, the stories of real people who are practicing and hearing what they did and what worked and how they applied the teachings in their life. Actually, those are the things that we remember often. And that kind of got me out of my own, like, oh, should I have these stories or not? And it really just became about what hopefully will make this make the teachings come to life for people who are reading it. So there's lots more things I could say, but I think that the piece about compassion and the motivation was probably the biggest one where my practice informed kind of how the whole thing took shape.
And it can be really vulnerable to put yourself out there and share those personal stories, but I think it also goes a long way to help your readers see themselves within you,
Yeah.
and see, oh, I've dealt with this too. There's a like a relatability, there's a connection I think that naturally happens and a source of inspiration too. So
Yeah,
thank you so
absolutely.
much for adding those pieces. And it's wonderful to hear that you have an editor support who sounds like she's got some superpowers that are helping you. That's great.
She definitely does.
Yeah. I one kind of more bigger question here before we move into the contents of the book. So I have to ask this, which is, what, if any, involvement does Mingyur Rinpoche have in a project like this? Is he on the radar, on the map? Does he? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways. I mean, of course, I talked to him before writing it, before I even did it to, see what he thought. And he had been at various times encouraged me to write a book. Actually, there was one time, this is back in like 2000, probably 9 or 10. He had asked me simultaneously to get a PhD, to write a book. We were starting Tergar. Basically, there were all things that were like huge multi-year projects. And I was like, Rinpoche, maybe we could prioritize a little bit. This is kind of a lot. So, um, yeah, so part of it was just checking in with him and seeing, what he thought about doing this at all. And there is a big piece in this tradition, in the Tibetan tradition in particular, about the having the connection with the lineage. If you're oftentimes you're teaching because your teachers have asked you to teach, and it can be a very healthy kind of balancing thing in one's life as a teacher. So just being able to check in and kind of that context, I think is just sort of a healthy balancing factor. Um, in terms of I mean, the biggest way is really the whole book is infused with his approach to Dharma. I mean, I like to think, I mean, whatever deviations from that are just my own misunderstandings and deficiencies as a student. But I really tried to lay this out from the perspective of his lineage and how he teaches Dharma, which for me has just been so incredibly helpful. It's just a very empowering view, and this idea that anything and everything can become an opportunity for practice, that our own shadows and inner demons and challenges are not things we need to run from, but this is where a lot of the learning and transformation happens. So just a lot of the things that he embodies and teaches really infuse the whole book, hopefully. At least that was my intention. How successful I was is another question. Um, and then of course he was involved. He wrote the foreword, and now we're going to be using this book as the first exploring Buddhism course for the Tergar community. So it'll obviously be very much um, in fact, that's how I wrote it, first and foremost, for people in the Tergar community. In particular, kind of imagining the people, for those of you who've done the joy of living, there's a point and I've been at this point, I think many people are, where you've been meditating for a while, you're interested in learning more about Buddhism, but you really don't know where to go. And I think that's basically what this book is for, and the online course we've developed is really for that point in the journey. Like how do we learn if this is something we want to explore further? So yeah, in many ways, his teachings, his inspiration is all over this book.
I think that you were successful, if it means anything.
Ming Rinpoche would read it and be like, "What?" He said this is
No,
based
this
on
is wrong.
wrong, wrong,
Gets out
wrong.
his red pen. Yes, and we'll talk about the Exploring Buddhism course at the end of this program today. The book is filled with so many wonderful quotes. I have to say, I love every single one of them. And my absolute favorite is one by Mingyur Rinpoche himself, which is that meditation is like ending a dysfunctional relationship to yourself. I personally think we should put that on a Tergar t-shirt.
Yeah, that is one of the best quotes of all time.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what this means from the Buddhist context and maybe weave in a personal story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh man, yeah, I could talk a lot about this from a personal point of view. I think at its heart, it has to do with two things. One is the beliefs that we tend to carry around about ourselves, oftentimes not even realizing that these are beliefs that we formed, based on a variety of factors. We just take them to be reality. Like we just think this is who we are and how we are. And then how we treat ourselves often, which simply put, we treat ourselves oftentimes in ways that we would never treat another person. We can be harsh with ourselves or just the self-talk in our heads, the way we can judge and criticize ourselves for, perceived mistakes or all sorts of things in a way that we would never treat a friend, a child, a parent, a loved one, or even, frankly, just a stranger off the street, we would probably treat better a lot of times than we treat ourselves. And meditation, I think, in many ways, is just an opportunity first to just see that more clearly. Like I know, for example, when I started meditating, I mentioned that I had a lot of anxiety and a lot of social anxiety, and I I just had so much toxic rumination in my head, and it was so biased to the negative. So a lot of what happens in meditation is we first just start to see that more clearly, and it helps us just to relearn how to be with ourselves and how to see ourselves. So at the beginning, I think it's even seeing that toxic rumination, that these are just thoughts and nothing more. They're not necessarily true. We start to see, like, we don't then start judging that. That would, of course, just be layering judgment upon the judgment. But we can start to see there's a different way to experience all of that in a way that it doesn't lead have the same emotional charge. It doesn't change and affect the way we see ourselves and see the world in quite the same way. But then slowly, it really shifts the way we see ourselves. We start to see that those thoughts, our emotional patterns, and so on, are just a tiny part of who we are. And there's this whole inner world of experience that we simply don't learn how to get in touch with. Um, a phrase that has been in my mind a lot recently is this idea of just having a rich inner life. And I think when I think about especially my early years as a meditator, that was a lot of what was happening to me is seeing that I had lived my life just totally focused on the externals, what I was doing, who I was with, just like the circumstances of life, and seeing that there's this inner world that is so interesting, so transformative when you begin to pay attention to it. And when you do, it opens these doors where you can't help but change the way you see yourself, the way you define yourself. So for me, going back to that experience of anxiety, that was such a huge part of my life when I started meditating. It dominated my experience. At the time, I was really stressed out. I was a college student. I was just beginning to really figure out who I was and who I would be in the world. But it was so much colored by the strong emotional experiences I was having at the time. And as I started to meditate, again, it wasn't so much that I just let go of the anxiety overnight. Of course, that was a very long, slow process, but it really just made me see that that was like there was this whole book, and that was just a single page. I was just beginning to open the rest of that book and to see everything else that was there. And yeah, I knew quite early on that this was really just was going to change everything for me, and it did, and it still does. It's an endlessly enriching process.
Wonderful. I'm going to pause before I ask the next question, and I'll just invite the slide to be shared again for those that need it. If you have any questions that are coming up for you that you would like to ask, please go ahead and scan the QR code using your phone camera, or you can click the link that will be shared in the chat, and we'll start taking some questions here in just a bit. Okay. So really the book is written from the perspective largely of the three yanas. Like you do a really nice section on each of the three yanas. And so, what I'd like to do for this part of the conversation is pull out some different big ideas that you talk about in the book. But maybe first, for those that may not have read the book or may not be familiar, can you just give like a high level overview of what the three yanas are?
The three yanas, simply put, are three different approaches that take us from a point of confusion and suffering to what in Buddhist terms is called awakening, or in more ordinary terms, you might say flourishing or really tapping our full potential as human beings. And in the Buddhist tradition, like all meditative and spiritual and religious traditions, it evolved over time. There's many different practices, ideas, and principles, and so on. And in the Buddhist tradition, it evolved in such a way that there was three different approaches basically to traveling the Buddhist path. And at one point in the Buddhist tradition, these were really three independent ways of practicing and training and transforming the mind, I guess you could say. But at a certain point, they started to be woven together and integrated. And that's really the form of Buddhism that made its way to Tibet. It's these three different approaches, but presented and integrated in such a way that as people, we can actually practice them in very simple ways that really gets the kind of the best, most powerful pieces of these three different approaches.
And so, one of the big ideas that you write about then initially, as it relates to the Hinayana, is renunciation. And
Mhm.
so, renunciation can be a really big topic. Like, I found initially when I was introduced to the idea of renunciation, for it to be a bit like cringeworthy, like
Yeah.
this feeling that I had to give up all the
Yeah, somebody's
things.
gonna yank the chocolate bar out of
Yeah.
you or something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And so you have this really wonderful quote by Sharon Salzberg that introduces this section, and she says, "All beings want to be happy, but very few know how." And so I'd be curious, what does renunciation actually mean in the Buddhist context, and how has this showed up for you personally?
Yeah, I think more than anything else, renunciation is about turning towards the possibility of something new. And there is in that always a letting go of something old, something outdated, something that's not working. So there is a letting go aspect to it, and that's the word renunciation in English. I don't know in other languages. Many of you are probably native speakers of other languages, but in English, it captures that letting go part, but it doesn't capture so well this sense of opening up to a new possibility. But that I think is really the most important part of this. So, at any point in life, when you start to see that something just isn't working, there is this element in the mind of getting real and honest with oneself. For me, again, I've now talked about this experience when that got me meditating in the first place, where I could just see there was something in the way I was living my life, in the way I was seeing myself, the way I was just how I was living, simply put, that wasn't working. I was struggling, I was suffering, and I could see the track I was on was not going to lead to anything different. So it takes that moment of being honest. But there was also equally a sense of a new potential. And when I read, for example, John Kabat-Zinn's book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, which is one of those books I mentioned earlier, it was inspiration. So in that moment, renunciation for me was this sense of, oh, there's this whole other way to do this thing called being human. I can work with my mind through meditation. I mean, I didn't know anything about meditation when I first started reading those books, but it opened up this new possibility. And for me, another really powerful experience that I talk about often, I think I talk about this in the book, uh, was an experience I had as a kid, really a teenager. I mentioned that I was reading all the time, and I've always been a reader. And I remember reading some of the great classics of Western literature, in particular, uh, reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, and also the works of Dostoevsky, who's one of my all-time favorite writers. And both, like in Les Miserables, for example, there's this character of the bishop, this very saintly character. And there's this defining moment where he basically the main character of the book steals from him, and instead of trying to punish him or get him in trouble, he actually gives him even more. And it's this act of selflessness and generosity that in my mind, when I read it, was so inspiring. Similarly, in the works of Dostoevsky and other authors, you have these amazing characters. Like Dostoevsky always has a kind of saintly character. But I remember when I was reading about those characters, I was inspired, but it didn't feel real to me in the sense that I didn't know how I could be like them. How could I have the compassion and the selflessness of this bishop in Les Miserables? It felt unattainable to me. So I was inspired, but there was really nowhere to go with the inspiration. I didn't know what I could do any differently. And so that moment of renunciation that we're talking about, it was almost like I got half of it, but not the full thing. But when I started reading books about meditation, and I started reading about great meditation masters, for example, from the Buddhist tradition, it felt like that inspiration of seeing these larger than life individuals being so inspired by the compassion, the wisdom that was just radiating from the page when I read about them. But there also was a path forward. It was clear that there was something I could do. There were steps I could take, especially through the practice of meditation. And I think that's really what renunciation is about. It's that combination uh, of the potential you sense, the fact that you feel that there's a path forward, there's a forward moving energy about it. There's an excitement, a sense of new possibilities. And in that, there's a recognition that to do that, you need to let go of something. We can't continue living how we've always lived and thinking how we've always thought. And that new possibility isn't going to come to life for us if we don't open up to something different. So I think it's really a combination of all of those things. And again, you're totally right. The word renunciation, it's just like, I wish we had I don't know. I mean, spent a lot of time translating. I wish I had a better word for it. There's just no good word in English that captures all of that.
Yeah, but I love what you're saying though, which is really kind of the positive aspect of turning towards something, finding inspiration and potential, and then in turning towards that, things naturally start falling away. I mean, certainly that was true of my own, practice as a beginning meditator and a beginning Buddhist. I lost friendships, like friendships naturally fell away, activities that I had been engaged in previously fell away. And within that, there, for me personally, was like a little bit of grief within that, but
Yeah.
also a lot of inspiration. So I think
Yeah, it's not,
there
yeah,
can be.
that's so well said. It's not easy and some things naturally fall away. In fact, that exact same experience I had, some of my friendships grew stronger and some naturally seemed to fall away. It's sort of an interesting process when you do things differently in your life.
Yeah, definitely. I want to move into the section about the Mahayana where you tell this really amazing and inspiring story of our dear Dharma brother, James Hopkins, who
Mhm.
founded the nonprofit called Quilts for Kids in Nepal. And I'm wondering if you could first just maybe give like a high level snapshot of that story for those that haven't read the book, that part of the book yet. And then maybe talk a little bit about how we can use James's insight about the unity of wisdom and compassion in our own lives, because I
Yeah.
thought that that story really brought that point home really beautifully.
Yeah, I love this story. I tell it all the time. And I've checked with him. I've cleared it with him that I can talk about this as commonly as I do because I really do mention it a lot. So James was a friend, actually my neighbor. He lived upstairs from me when I was living in Kathmandu, and I got to know him. And as you just mentioned, Stephanie, he started this nonprofit called Quilts for Kids. And the way it happened was really quite amazing. He had gone to what this almost institution in Kathmandu, in the area where we lived, which is an area called Boda in Kathmandu. Mingyur Rinpoche's brother has a monastery. This is Chikinima Rinpoche. And I don't know if this is still happening. It probably is, but there used to be a teaching every Saturday morning. It was like going to church. Everybody would go to the Saturday morning teaching at Chikinima Rinpoche's monastery. And he went to this one day, and as Chukyinima Rinpoche and many lamas often teach, it was about bodhicitta, compassion, benefiting others. It was all about, how to really live a life of compassion. And he was a little confused by this because the teachings are often about all sentient beings, like this very, very vast vision, almost unattainably vast. Like you can't, like who can actually help all sentient beings? And it feels, on the one hand, it's inspiring, but okay, what do you actually do? I think is the sort of the head scratching experience that you can have when it's not so clear, where how you actually bring that in very specific ways into your life. So he went up after the teaching to meet with Chukyinma Rinpoche. This too is another kind of part of the experience. You can kind of go up and there's this big greeting room. It's like it's a whole little scene and you can ask questions. So he went up to Chukyinma Rinpoche after the teachings and said something to the effect of like, this is great. I'm really inspired. I always love hearing these teachings on compassion and bodhicitta. But what do I actually do? Like, how do I actually practice that beyond my meditation session and thinking nice thoughts? And Chukyinma Rinpoche said, get up, and when you get up and leave, just help the first person you encounter as best you can. Simplest thing, but really quite a profound statement. So he got up and left shortly thereafter, and he walked out of the monastery. And the first person he encountered was a young woman who was begging for money. And this is also a very common thing. In fact, I myself had this experience in my very first day when I was there in that area. And there's a huge begging community, and it's almost like a job. Actually, it's not almost like a job. It is a job. Like it's a whole even family profession where whole families, that's basically what they're doing full time. They take their kids out of school, and it's a very destructive cycle of poverty because although they get some income from it, they take their children out of school because children are frankly the most lucrative when it comes to begging. And so they don't get an education, and consequently other possibilities are not open to them. So there's this little begging approach that they do in this area where you'll have a young woman holding a baby. This is exactly what James encountered as he walked out of the gate. And the woman will point to the baby, and actually, usually it's not even the woman's baby. You don't know this, but there's this. I mean, it's basically a whole kind of a whole racket they have to, to get as much money as they can. But what they'll do is they'll say, "Oh, my baby, sir, can you please help me get milk for my baby?" Or ma'am, please, I need milk for my baby. And you're walking out of a Buddhist teaching, and there's a clearly impoverished woman, young woman asking for milk for her baby. I mean, who could say no to that, right? I mean, it's like you can see why they do it is because it works. But what they do then is they take you to a nearby shop and they buy a powdered milk packet that's very expensive. It's like like in the US, like 10 US dollars, like a huge milk packet. And at that point, you're like confused. You're like, wait a minute, powdered? It's like the kind of stuff you put in coffee, like cream, like creamed powdered milk. And you're like, what is going on here? Basically, what happens is you buy that for them because you're so confused at that point, you don't know what to do. And then later they go back and they sell that back to the shopkeeper and they pocket the money. So they sell it for a little less than they bought it for. The shopkeeper makes a little money, they make a little money. So that's basically what happens. So, anyways, he walked out the gate, but he's lived there for a long time. So he knows the racket, he knows what's going on. And he thinks to himself, okay, I need to help this woman, but just doing this by just giving her some money, that's just perpetuating the cycle that's keeping her and her family and her community in poverty. Like it's maybe kind and maybe it's going to help her right in this moment, but it certainly does not seem wise to do that. To your point, Stephanie, this balance of wisdom and compassion was clearly in his mind. So he thought, okay, I don't want to just perpetuate this toxic cycle that she's almost a victim of in some respects. So why don't I just go back and see what her situation like, and maybe there's some other way I can help her. So to make a very long story, well, I shouldn't say that, I've already made it long, but to make it slightly less shorter, it's slightly shorter. He basically goes back to her village, and it's this whole encampment, kind of a shantytown type place where her community lives. And he sees that they make these beautiful quilts. And he thinks, oh, maybe there's something here. Maybe we could actually shift this and get them to make these quilts, and we could use that money to put the kids through school rather than putting them out on the street begging. So that eventually led to them to him creating this whole nonprofit, which is going to this day. Uh, Again, it's called Quilts for Kids. I recommend supporting it if you can. It's a really wonderful endeavor. And it just came out of that very heartfelt wish to be of service, but also balancing it with wisdom. So I think that, to go back to the how we can practice this, it's simply put, as Chukyinma Rinpoche mentioned, it's just whatever shows up in your life, having that attitude and willingness and motivation to help, but also injecting a little wisdom into that. Like, what's actually going to be of skillful here? So sometimes that might be setting a healthy boundary in a difficult relationship. It's not always smiling and hugs. Sometimes it might be standing up to injustice or working for climate change. Sometimes it might need a very forceful response. So again, compassion can look many different ways, and it's really this willingness to step back, to be less reactive, more thoughtful and responsive, but anchoring that in deep, deep compassion and a willingness to really be there for the suffering of the world. Oh, you're muted, Stephanie.
I love that story so much. Thank you for
Sorry, I
telling
did
that.
I think I got an F in summarizing, but hopefully you got the point.
No, definitely, definitely. That was great. Okay, so we are going to take questions. I just have two more questions that I want to hear from you, Cord, and then we'll take some of the questions from the audience. So, one of the, I think, most beautiful and often challenging things about Vajrayana Buddhism is the ritual aspect. So, of course, this tradition is just complete with tons of ritual that, when we're new, can often feel very confusing. We hear chanting and drumming, and we've got visualization and all of these different elements. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your early experiences in working with Vajrayana rituals and what advice you would give to Joy of Living practitioners as they enter the path of liberation.
Yeah, this is a very interesting one. So in one of the key points of the Vajrayana, which is the third of these three yanas, is this idea that awakening, enlightenment, inner freedom, realization, all these fancy esoteric sounding terms that we use, that these are actually not describing some attainment or some goal that we reach after we meditate for a million years, but they're actually describing the reality of who we are. They're describing what in Buddhist terms we call Buddha nature, that our true nature, who we truly are, is whole and perfect and complete. It's filled with these qualities like awareness, compassion, and wisdom. And really, because of that, the path, meaning the stuff we do in our practice, is really a process of exploring and discovering that. So for me, the terminology I like to describe this is that it's less about self-improvement and it's really more about self-discovery. We're simply learning to see things that we otherwise would not see. So the question is how? How do we actually do that? And there's different ways we can do that. In the Vajrayana tradition, the very unique way that is offered is that instead of pushing against the natural rhythms, currents, and energies of life, we use what occurs naturally in our experience as human beings, and we just subtly shift that towards this process of exploration and discovery. And that's a powerful thing. So rather than, for example, our minds are filled with thoughts. That's what our minds do. They just think, they imagine, they project into the future, they dwell on the past, and words, imagery, whole worlds are conjured up in our minds. And so our minds have this creative capacity, and there's different ways to relate to that. You could say, "Oh, I'm meditating on my breath, so I just need to turn that off and stop doing that. That's a distraction." The Vajrayana takes a very different approach. It says, no, the mind imagines, the mind thinks. Why not use that creative potential of the mind and just channel it towards self-exploration and self-discovery? So when you visualize, for example, you're basically just using that creative capacity of the mind, but rather than having that be toxic rumination where we're just stressing out about our day, or getting stressed out about something that might happen in the future or might never happen in the future, we use that as a way to point us back towards these innate qualities of awareness, compassion, and wisdom. We turn it towards our Buddha nature, rather than using it to reinforce a very limited, impoverished sense of who and what we are. So you could say that really about everything in the Vajrayana. That's just one example. Um, and I mentioned earlier when I saw all of this imagery in the Tibetan tradition, it totally turned me off, actually. It took me, as I said, a couple of years before I was even willing to just explore that and see what that was all about. What I didn't realize is that that's what it is. It felt very theistic to me, felt like you're worshiping gods and goddesses. I didn't see that, no, this is actually a skillful way to use the mind's creative potential to orient to these awakened qualities that we all have. So ritual is another aspect of that. For example, there's this thing called mudras where you're just using your hands in different gestures. And it looks, honestly, it just looks weird when you first see it. I mean, if you don't know what it is, you're like, what on earth is going on here? But it's really just taking the fact that we have bodies, our bodies are moving, right? And we do different things. Actually, we have gestures that carry meaning. You know, you can wave, you can give a thumbs up. I could do other ones that would be a little less pleasant, other hand gestures that we have in every culture. And these all mean things, right? Like they carry a lot of meaning. We have memories, we have cultural associations, they're linked to experiences and ideas, all sorts of things, just layers of meaning and association just on basic movements of our hands. So again, that's just a simple example that we are embodied beings, and you can use that to form new associations. So rather than reinforcing the samsaric way of viewing things, in other words, the way of being in the world that just creates and perpetuates suffering, you use movement and gestures in a way that reminds you of who you truly are, that reminds you to get in touch with your true nature. So you can do that with the body, with movement, with the imagination. You can do it with life experiences like dreaming, even deep dreamless sleep, death and dying, just all of these human experiences. It's the Vajrayana approach is how do you use the energy of those experiences to get in touch with this awakened nature? And you just do that in many ways. So it looks very weird at times, but that underlying principle is really the thread that runs throughout all of it.
I think back personally to the first time that I was in Bodh Gaya, and it was the first exposure that I had had to mudras. And I sat there just fumbling, like I'm looking around, and everybody seems to have it together and know what they're doing. And here's me, like trying to figure out what I'm doing. And I just had so much kindness from a couple of the people that were sitting near me that they knew what they were doing and they saw that I was struggling and then they just came over and helped me. So I guess the reason why I'm sharing that is just because if you are confused and you're new, to seek help from others is a really, really wonderful and totally appropriate thing to do. Like no one expects you to know how to do these things, at the very beginning.
Yeah, no, it's so true, and everybody has that experience. I certainly do, and it's one of the ironic things about community practice, which can be so helpful. But I just know the experience that I've had so many times, especially early on as a meditator, where you're sitting and meditating, and you look around the room, and everybody just looks like they're little Buddhas, like they're just blissing out with perfectly clear minds and they're sitting there in perfect posture. And then my mind is just totally distracted and all over the place. And I'm like, what is going on here? But actually, everybody's having that same experience. And that's the power, I think, of not just practicing together, but talking about practice together. Because once you start talking about it, you see, oh, everybody else, has struggles in practice too. Everybody else has a mind that's wandering all over the place. And the appearance, it's like going on Instagram where everybody's life looks perfect. Of course, what you see on Instagram is not the reality of everybody's life, right? That's like how it looks on the surface. So, anyways, there's a lot to, I think, just the power of conversation, which is something Mingyur Rinpoche has always emphasized, is so, so helpful because it just helps us both see what's really going on and then really just to feel a little more accepting of our experience because we see that it's often very universal. Many people experience the same things.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was coming to my mind as you were talking about the power of conversation is just the unique approach that Mingyur Rinpoche brings to the creation of our Tergar practice groups and how the practice groups are centered around practice, but also around discussion. And even though you may be doing the same practice that you've done many, many, many times, to be able to engage in conversation about it really brings things to life and can also help normalize what
Yeah.
any challenges that you're going through in your practice.
Yeah, it's something we I think oftentimes miss that need to find ways to recreate in the modern world because historically, if you think about how somebody would have been doing these practices, they would have had a very strong community support system for what they're doing. I was just hanging out last night with Kempo Sherab Sangpo, who's been one of my main teachers in my life. I hadn't seen him for a long time, but have spent a lot of time with. And he was just talking about his life as a monk, a meditator. And that's like what you grow up with. I mean, if like he grew up in this monastic setting in Tibet, and you're surrounded by other people who are doing exactly what you're doing. And so you can talk every day with other people, hear what's going on for them, what their struggles are, what they're doing and how they're dealing with them. But oftentimes we're on our own. We go to an online retreat or we do an online course, and then we're just sitting at home by ourselves, meditating. And we don't have that social support system that is so important for our practice. But I think we're finding ways to recreate that in this, very different world that we live in. But it's super important. And I think as I mentioned, as somebody who's more introverted by nature, it took me a long time to appreciate how important it is just to have friends and other people who you can talk about this stuff with and hear what they're doing and share what you're doing. It's so helpful.
Thank you. And it's so wonderful to hear that you were with Kempo
Yeah.
yesterday. Great. Yeah, I don't know if you remember, but that's I think how we know each other originally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I definitely remember. I traumatized Stephanie by trying to teach her Tibetan, which I hadn't. I probably was good at speaking Tibetan, but I guarantee I was not good at teaching Tibetan. So sorry,
That
Stephanie, for
yes.
terrorizing you with my
Yes. Oh, that was yes. I have Tibetan Tibetan PTSD with Cortland Dahl. All right, I do just want to ask one more question because I think that this is a really important one, and then I'll get into the questions from the group. So, in the book, you talk about three different practice traditions in Tibetan Buddhism as the scholar, the yogi, and the householder. And we can see, great practitioners like Mingyur Rinpoche going off and doing something really radical like going on a wandering 4-year retreat. And then we look at our own practice, and many of us can barely find time to practice because we're managing the many demands in our lives, whether you're working or raising families or dealing with aging parents. And so, whatever other complexities, we are all dealing with in our lives. And so, many of us, and I'll just speak for myself personally, I can often feel like my practice is not enough when we get into this like comparing mind of comparing our practice to others' practice. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the tradition of the householder yogi and why it's important in modern times.
yeah. This is such an important question. If we look at how the tradition is coming down to us in the modern world, most of the books, the teachings, even the stories we hear from these traditions are coming mostly either from the scholarly part of the lineage or what you might call the yogic side. Like this is like Milarepa, the hardcore meditation side. And this is beautiful. I mean, these are very important, profound aspects of the lineages and certainly things we need to preserve, in the modern world as we reinvent these traditions for the 21st century. But it's also important to recognize that for the most part, these were written by and for people who were full-time scholars or full-time meditators, which is not where the vast majority of us live our lives. Most of us have jobs or families or other things, and we want to study, we want to practice, we want to make this part of our lives, but we're not monks and nuns, where we can devote ourselves to this full time. Meanwhile, there is this tradition of the householder, but in a very traditional sense, it was often viewed as gathering merit. It kind of basically you're supporting the monastic sangha, and the idea was you generate virtue and merit, and then in a future birth you might be able to be a scholar or a yogi or kind of enter the path more fully. But as you alluded to, Stephanie, there is this other strand in the tradition that's never really been the mainstream, but it's there, which is what you might call the householder yogi, which is somebody who has a family, has a job, has stuff going on, but yet is really practicing. And I think the unique thing and the opportunity for us as practitioners or people who are interested in this tradition in the 21st century is how do we bring the application of these practices and principles into all the things that we are now doing in the modern world. So like right now, for example, we're all staring at our screens. We're on Zoom or you're watching YouTube or whatever. And this is, for better or worse, this is just the reality of the world. But you're not going to find that in some traditional Dharma book. You're not going to find like, okay, how do you practice Dharma and bring more awareness, compassion, and wisdom into your fifth Zoom meeting of the day? Like that is not in any Buddhist sutra that I'm aware of. But those are the books and the teachings we need to create in the modern world. So I think this is an exciting time. In my mind, this is like the frontier. This is the pioneering spirit of Dharma in the 21st century, is how to take these beautiful, beautiful teachings on the view of this tradition and the meditation practices of this tradition and take the application of them in daily life and dial that way up. We need to write the books, tell the stories, share the practical tips for how we do this at the dinner table, for how we do this in a meeting, for how we do this in all the gazillion of hours we're staring at screens, how we do this in the hundreds of times we're picking up our phones. Like we need to create that. We need to invent all of that and to create the support system for ourselves and for each other and for the world so that we can infuse all of that with the Dharma. So to me, that's exciting. And I think we're at the beginning of figuring out what that might look like. But I think it's important to recognize that in the absence of that, it's frankly just going to leave all of that open space, which is most of our lives, for everything else that's going on in the world. And we can just see what happens. It's a world of distraction, fear, anxiety, and social division. There's not a lot of stuff that's promoting being more aware and present or being more kind and caring. So we have to do that consciously and intentionally. But I think there's a lot of ways we can do it.
Well, and I just see so much of the work that you've been doing at Tergar and also our collective work, you and I at Healthy Minds Innovations, has really been trying to move this householder yogi kind of idea forward into the world and helping people understand how to apply practice in the midst of their daily lives.
Yeah. I mean, something as simple as thinking of meditation not just as formal sitting meditation, but the idea of active meditation, which, as you know, Stephanie's, because we've worked on this together in like the Healthy Minds app and also in the new Joy of Living program. This is all based on Rinpoche's idea of anytime, anywhere meditation. I mean, it's basically just that. But that's kind of amazing when you think of you can have guided meditations and instructions, not just for when you sit down for your formal sitting meditation, but you're commuting to work. What is the commuting to work with compassion practice? What is the spending the first few minutes of sitting down with your family at dinner as an interdependence reflection? I mean, there's just countless ways that all the things we already do in our life can be deep opportunities to explore this and really just to totally change not what we're doing, but how we're doing it and how we see the things we do.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to move into some questions from the audience here. So, the first question that I'd like to ask is, how do you feel about Buddhism and contemporary society? Are the teachings as relevant today as when they were first expressed by Shakyamuni Buddha?
Yeah, in some respects, I think they're even more relevant, certainly as relevant. And I talk a lot about this in the book, really using the story of the Buddha himself and how he saw that he was really doing everything that his upbringing and his society were telling him to do to be happy, that the things he needed to do to live a fulfilling life, to be content, to be successful, whatever the case may be, and seeing that he did all of that and it just was not working out. And I think we now live in a world where that impulse is even amplified. It's just we have this collective fantasy that if we just can get our health and body just right, if we can just get our relationships right, if we can just find the right job and have all the right things, then suddenly we're all going to be happy. But we know this, forget about Dharma, just from a scientific point of view. If you look at the science of well-being and flourishing, one of the most interesting insights is that when it comes to just how content and fulfilled we feel in our life, about 40% of the variability in that is due to our genetics, and 10%, only 10% is due to the circumstances of our life. Meaning the things we usually think of as the stuff that will make us happy, you know, our health, our relationships, our jobs, all of that stuff, that only accounts for 10%. 40% is in the realm of things that we can do. It's our mindset, it's our attitude, it's the activities we choose to do or to not do. So a huge amount of the variability when it comes to our well-being and happiness and ability to flourish is really in these things that we can control, but we focus usually on that 10%. We're trying to control things over which we have very little control. And we don't put much effort, especially if we're not meditating and doing things like that, in this huge space of 40%. So this is not even Dharma. This is just kind of basic science showing this. And to me, it really just underscores the importance of this basic insight from the Buddhist tradition, which is if we just do the same things we've always done, we are going to get the same result. And if we sense that there is some potential, some inspiration, some new possibility for us, something needs to shift. And oftentimes it's more of our mindset. It's not going to be the circumstances. The circumstances we can't change. We're not going to have perfect health our whole life. We're not going to have relationships that never have any bumps. We're not going to have a life where we experience no loss or grief. This is the stuff, this is that 10%. We're not going to be able to change all of that. So anyways, I think the teachings are as relevant today, and perhaps even more so than they've been in times past.
Great. So this next question comes from someone who is new to Tibetan Buddhism and also arrived at this interest in Tibetan Buddhism late in life. How should we view practices like Ngondro that seem impossible to take up? Is it too late for me to make true progress in the Tibetan tradition?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that one of the things you see in the Tibetan tradition is there's a whole sequence of different practices you can do. And at the beginning, it might feel like, wow, like, especially if you're coming to this later in life, like, why, there's so many different practices, there's so many different things to learn. But actually, any one of those can be deeply, deeply transformative. And one of the things you start to see as you practice more and more and more, you start to see that actually the whole path is included in each of those practices. There's so much richness in each of those practices. So with Ngondro, for example, this is a set of practices that sometimes called the preliminary practices or the foundational practices. It's a sequence of contemplations and then a sequence of practices where you use the imagination and other elements of meditation, basically to enact a process of inner purification and inner exploration, where, as we've talked about, you start to get in touch with these awakened qualities of mind. But even if you just did the first part of that, I think you could literally take just the contemplation of the precious human life and a contemplation of impermanence. And if that's all you did, that could take you the whole distance. So I would look at it less as needing to finish that practice or any practice, and more that any one of those practices actually could be a lifetime practice. You could do that your entire life, and it would be incredibly profound and transformative, I promise you. So much so that one of the things you see in this tradition is that a lot of the great masters of this tradition are doing these quote unquote preliminary practices, the Ngondro practices, on their deathbed. These are the practices and it's because they contain all the profundity of the whole path. So I wouldn't worry about finishing it, and just go deeply with wherever you are on the path. Just give it everything you got, and you won't go wrong. It doesn't matter how far you get or how fast you get there. That is kind of utterly inconsequential.
Thank you for that response. The next question is, do you see the evolution of the lineage for the modern age as a way to enhance mental health and support the sense of purpose that we all need to feel connected and engaged in all the aspects of our busy lives?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you could say that even in very traditional Buddhist contexts, there's always been this element of in addition to the more Buddhist part of it, awakening and enlightenment, things like that, of just simply being a good human being and living a rich, fulfilling life that is feels balanced and so forth. So now in this day and age, you have all sorts of meditation practices and ideas are flowing into the world of mental health and being influenced by the world of mental health. The way I see it, I think this is just a gateway for people to open the doors to that rich inner life. For some of them, it might go further into something that, looks like a more kind of traditional Buddhist practice. For some people, it might be adding depth and richness to something they're doing in another tradition or just to care for their own minds. So I think that how we benefit from this, how we use these teachings, uh, can and should vary a lot from person to person. But to me, I feel like it's wonderful that it's kind of finding ways to really just alleviate suffering in more ordinary ways for people out in the world. So I'm quite excited by that. And I think for many people, it's just opening these doors to exploring their minds in ways they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do.
The next question is, I am doing the joy of living and loving it. I feel that this is all the teaching that I want, and that going into the more complex parts of Tibetan Buddhism will leave me feeling overwhelmed and maybe even lead me to dropping it altogether. What can you say about this?
Stick with joy of living. I think always there's always a voice. I think for most of us, maybe there's a rare individual that doesn't have this, where there's some intuition of just what feels right. And oftentimes there's another voice that I think of as the voice of should. I should do this. I feel like I should study that. I should practice that, or I should do this, that, or the other. In my experience, that voice of should is almost always based on fear. It's almost always based on something, kind of self-judgment or fear or something like that. And there's that more simple voice of just, okay, this just feels right. I'm just going to take this step and trust that. So this other stuff is not going anywhere. It may be that a year or 2 years from now, something shifts and you feel totally differently. Or it might be that it doesn't shift at all and you're just fine. You're really benefiting from the practices you're learning and the joy of living. If that's working for you, it's beneficial, then I would just say stick with that. And this other stuff, it's always going to be there if you want to explore it. The only footnote I would add to that is there is an interesting dynamic between the sense of what feels right and the importance at times in practice of pushing against the boundaries of our comfort zone. And that's something that I think each of us has to answer for ourselves. I think nobody can tell us, when we're getting a little too comfortable and when we need to really push up against those boundaries. But I would say if you've been practicing something for a long time and it just can feel a little stagnant, like, okay, this is still nice, but it's just kind of not going anywhere. Like you've gotten the insights you're going to get from that, and it doesn't feel like there's a lot of growth, a lot of any new frontiers happening. Then sometimes it might be helpful to push into some new space, and that can feel a little challenging, but it's not that voice of should that's driving that. It's still that sense of potential and inspiration, that sense of possibility, and it just gets you to shift out of your comfort zone a little bit. So again, that's an utterly personal thing. Nobody can answer that for you, but I think it's a helpful dynamic to look at and practice over time.
Really wonderful advice. Thank you for that. The next two questions are actually about meditating for busy lives. So you obviously have a very full life. How do you structure your days to integrate a daily practice? How do you respond if a day gets off track?
Yeah. I think the first thing is this distinction that we talked about earlier about thinking of your practice as just the 30 minutes in the morning versus living a life of meditation. And for me, the biggest lesson I had, and this was when my son was born. I was living in Nepal at the time, and I went from this period where I was doing a lot of practice. I was doing a lot of practice during the day. I'd like my daily practice. I was totally immersed in studying and I was translating books. I was like totally immersed in my practice and doing usually at least one, sometimes two, three, even 5 months of practice, like retreat a year. So I was like really, really practicing and studying full time. And then my son was born, and everything in a day changed. Everything overnight completely changed. And it started to be what is practice, when it's 3 a.m. and I'm carrying him, and he's woken up crying and I'm carrying him on my shoulder. Like now that's practice. And it took me some time to adjust. And there was a period in which I felt like, oh, I'm now just a failed meditator. Like I had my quote unquote real practice. I can't do that anymore. And I'm just not practicing in the way I felt like I should practice. Again, it's that voice of should. And then at a certain point, it shifted and I started to see I need to just practice with the life I have, not some fantasy of a life I don't have. And then it was beautiful. It started to be not like I said, I until my son was 3 years old, one of my daddy duties, and I was lucky to be working from home at that time, and I would lie down with him when he took a nap every single time, like every single nap he took for years. That was sort of my little ritual I had with him, and I feel so blessed that I had the circumstances where I could do that. And that became like a period of meditation, but it was obviously not me sitting up in formal meditation and doing some chant or visualization. It was just this very sweet moment of what is awareness, compassion, and wisdom, but now lying with this little sentient being and as he, goes down for a nap. And it could be anything, right? It could be your commute to work. It could be jogging. It could be any, whatever it is, just make the things that are your daily rituals, make them into rituals of practice. And again, it just takes a little creativity. And of course, having a formal meditation practice really helps with that, right? That helps create space in the mind and experience so that you have that momentum. So having periods of retreat, even if it's a day or 2 days or whatever you can manage to do, having retreat in life is incredibly helpful and powerful. Having a daily practice is incredibly helpful and powerful. But just knowing that, I think I say in the Healthy Minds app, which Stephanie and I have both been involved with, missing a day of practice is not failure, right? That's life. Like we just have complicated lives. We're not living in monasteries. Sometimes you plan to practice first thing in the morning, and then, you get a call and suddenly your schedule changes. That's fine. Just practice on your commute home or practice before you're going to bed. Or some days you might just miss a day and just pick it up the next day and start again. That's the nature of the path. So I think it's really the viewing your life as a creative process and where you can bring the Dharma to life in the life you actually have rather than fantasizing about a life that's not, reality for you in the moment.
What I really appreciate about you sharing the story about CJ is just what a positive influence then that has on those relationships, like when you're
Mm,
practicing very directly in the moment. And it was so sweet because I had the opportunity to see you and your son at your book launch in
mm.
Minneapolis. And when you were leading a guided meditation, like CJ was just right up there. I mean, he immediately went into his meditative posture, and I'm like, okay, there's been some good modeling here.
That's good. Actually, I did see that. He was off to the side, so.
Yeah, impressive for an 18-year-old, I have to say. Okay, so I think that that actually was the last question that we will have time for. I want to just turn now to talking about a couple of upcoming events that we have to support your practice. And so the first one, Court, is actually an interview that you're going to be doing with Judson Brewer. And maybe before I talk about the details of that, you could maybe just talk about what you're excited about this conversation with Judson and who
Yeah,
he is.
Jed is an amazing guy. He's a friend of mine who's one of the leading scientists in the area of exploring meditation, the effects of meditation on the brain in particular. Brilliant, brilliant guy, and he's also a very, very deep meditation practitioner. And he's actually a perfect example of what we've been talking about, of how you kind of bring this perspective into different areas of life. So he's gonna what his unique expertise is really actually something that you yourself, Stephanie, are also an expert in, which is really habits, both forming healthy habits and letting go of unhealthy habits. So he's done a lot of work and research and inner exploration as a practitioner and meditator in things like quitting smoking, anxiety, food cravings, just the kind of stuff that we just get stuck in sometimes unhealthy habits with. But we're going to be talking about it from the point of view of this area of Buddhist psychology called Abhidharma, which is really this very nuanced exploration of the mind and different mental states so that we can really see, for example, with addiction, with craving, with unhealthy behaviors, we can really understand the whole dynamic display of the mind so that we can work with it in a more balanced way. So he's, for my, in my opinion, just really one of the most brilliant minds in the world on bringing Buddhist principles to bear on real world problems and then linking it up with some of the really cool, interesting work in modern science. So I think it'll be a great, great discussion. And he's a very, very interesting guy.
Yeah, he's very warm and very relatable, which I really appreciate about him. So if we could have the slide pulled up about that event so that we can share the details. So this conversation, it will be a webinar that will take place on October 12th, and you can register at events.tergar.org. We'll see if this slide can make its way up here. Okay, so the next event then that I want to talk about, or the next offering, is this really exciting new course that is offered on Vajrayana Online called A Meditator's Guide to Buddhism. And Court, could you talk a little bit about this course? I know you had alluded to it earlier, but maybe just talk about what it is and why it matters.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically what we've been talking about. So from the time Shambhala um, made the initial request for this book, and we started talking, um, I started talking with others at Shambhala, and we had some conversations within Tergar. Actually, we designed it. We thought about from the very beginning that it could be both a book and an online course. So this was actually the vision from the very beginning. And the motivation is exactly what we shared earlier. It's really meant for new meditators, or not necessarily new meditators, but for people who are newer to Buddhism, to be that course where it just gives you this, hopefully, a roadmap of what this tradition is all about and what life as a meditator in this tradition looks like. And for people who've been meditating for a while, a way to kind of zoom back out to really reorient to the most important guiding features of the whole tradition. So hopefully it will be helpful to meditators at all levels. And a lot of the things, are really meant to kind of flesh out elements of the book. For example, having a lot of guided meditations. We have a lot of active meditations, the stuff that we've talked about here. So not just formal sitting meditations, but things that are more real world, how to apply these teachings in daily life. A lot of amazing teachings from Mingyur Rinpoche, who I think most of you probably already know. But if you're new to Mingyur Rinpoche's world, he is just an extraordinary meditation teacher, a really, really extraordinary being and meditation teacher. So I think hopefully will be just a really helpful roadmap to what the path of awakening looks like from the Tibetan point of view.
And so we'd like to show a brief trailer preview of the course. So we'll go ahead and show just a very short video here.
So whole teaching is about to discover the nature of reality, nature of yourself. Then you're free. So this is about the essence of the Buddha Dharma, and through this study, we hope that you all will have map of the Buddha Dharma. Buddha said, yes, of course, we all have suffering, but there's a way out. And the way out is the teaching, what we call Dharma, the practice. So there's so many skills. In a way, we are learning new skills. And special, what Buddha said, actually, everybody has wonderful nature. Everybody is the Buddha. Everybody is enlightened.
What is the practical path that we can use to bring about this new change that we'd like to see in ourselves? So this is why I wrote the book, A Meditator's Guide to Buddhism. It's really a book for people like me and perhaps like you who've begun to meditate or even perhaps have been meditating for years and years or even decades and simply want a clearer picture of what the Buddhist path has to say about exploring and transforming the mind.
Doesn't matter you are new or you are already learned Buddhist practice teachings a lot in the past. Just take it, whatever you understand, you can take it. And if you don't understand, leave it for now. And you can come back anytime later, and then you can practice more, further and further.
I'm really excited about this course, and I hope that those of you that are watching consider joining us for this really wonderful introduction to Buddhism. I think it sounds like it's an opportunity to, if you're new, to be introduced to some of the key principles in Buddhism, but then also if you have an existing practice, to also give you an opportunity to deepen as well. So Court, we're coming to the end of our time together. Would love to invite you to share any closing words for us here.
Well, just to end on a note of gratitude, we've got a whole cast of characters who have been working for a long time, setting up this events and all the many things that we do in Tergar. So just a note of gratitude to all of you who have been working behind the scenes to make this possible. And to my dear Dharma sister, Stephanie, wonderful to share a few minutes with you. As you all heard, we go way, way back from the days where I was torturing her by trying in a very unskillful way to teach her and a few other people Tibetan, but been a close, dear friend for many years. So I really appreciate you taking the time. But especially to all of you who have joined for this period. I mean, it's Saturday, it might be the morning, it might be afternoon or even evening for some of you. And it's so hard to find time, to make time for things like this. And it always just touches my heart that we can share these kinds of things in a world that is really hurting. There is so much suffering in the world. There's so much conflict. And frankly, the world just needs more wisdom and compassion. So I think all of us making time for this in our lives is so important. So it's really so wonderful that you've spent some time with us, and it means a lot to us to share a few minutes with you. So whether it's through the book or the online course or in other ways, we really look forward to connecting with you and staying connected in the future as well. So thank you for taking the time.
Yes, and I just want to say thank you to you, Court, for writing the book in the midst of a very busy life, managing multiple work streams and family obligations and such. So thank you. It's a really wonderful contribution to, the literature on Buddhism. And thank you all for joining us. Thanks for all of the support that Tergar has offered to put on this event. And we look forward to connecting with you at an upcoming opportunity, an upcoming event. So hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.